Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to be doing level 3 of writing the equation of a trig function when you're given a graph. And so the two things that we already know are we're going to add the midline onto the end of both of our equations. And the midline is that line that is centered directly in the middle of the vertical top and bottom. We also know that we are going to be finding the amplitude. So you're going from the midline to the maximum or the midline to the minimum. And that is A out in front. You can do that for both midline to minimum, midline to maximum. It's still A out in front. The other thing that we're going to do is if our function is reflected upside down, then we're going to make a negative sign. So usually sign from the y-intercept right here has a high peak and then a low peak. It's going to be reflected upside down if the low peak comes first and then the high peak. So we'll make a negative if that's the case. And then for cosine, usually from the y-intercept, you have your U shape. So usually we're looking for this U, and it'll be reflected upside down. If it looks more so like an upside down U hill, that would make a negative as well. Today we're going to be adding on to that is when our periods may be different. So we are looking at one full rotation from 0 to 2 pi. Usually a sine graph takes from 0 to 2 pi. And that can change with switching the number right out in front of x. And we're going to call this number in our equation b. So if the period changes, b is going to be affected in our equation. So let's look at two different examples. You could either have a period happening quicker, so you could have a period of pi, or you could have a period that usually takes longer than it did before. Just like with cosine, usually a period lasts 2 pi. You could have that happen quicker, or you could also have it be a longer period, and that will affect b in the cosine equation also. When we are looking at our graph and we see what the period is, we're going to find b using the period. So we're going to take our formula for b. It's going to be 2 pi divided by the period. So let's do a couple examples. This first one, we automatically know that it is sine. And I'm going to go to my dotted graph. I'm going to find the midline first. So my highest point of my graph is 1. The lowest point of my dotted graph is 5. That means it's 6 units tall. So 3 up from the bottom is going to give me my midline. 1, 2, 3. My midline will be right here at y equals -2. So -2 goes on the very end. Next thing I want to do is I want to find the amplitude. And so I'm going to go from the midline to a maximum peak. And I see that it took 1, 2, 3 units. So 3 is going to go in front of my sign. I am going to think about what sine usually looks like. For the parent function, you have your high peak and then your low peak. I am going to outline. I'm going to go start at my y-intercept. I do have a high peak to a low peak, so I can see that it's not reflected. My a is going to stay positive. I do not put a negative on the 3. But now the last thing that I need to do is I need to solve for my b. What number goes right here? Because it didn't take the usual 2 pi units. It took me from 0 to 10 pi to complete one period. So my b is going to be 2 pi divided by my period of 10 pi. I need to simplify that. Pi over pi cancels out. 2 over 10, you could divide the top and bottom by 2. And we get our simplified fraction of 1/5. We can do that again with our next example. So I'm going to start by finding the midline. I have a max point of -1, a midpoint of -3. My midline's right between that at -2. So at the end of my equation, I'm going to put -2. I'm going to look for the amplitude going from the midline to the maximum is 1 unit. So I can put that right there. I'm going to trace a cycle, and I know that I'm talking about sine again, and it specifically tells me that I'm talking about sine with the equation that we're trying to write. So we're looking for a high peak to a low peak. So I'm going to go ahead and trace. Starting at the y-intercept, I have high peak to low peak. We're good. It's not reflected upside down, so my 1 is going to stay positive, but I have to solve for b. So right now, looking at my period, it took me from 0 to 2 pi over 3. So my period is 2 pi over 3, but I need to solve for what that means in my equation right here. So I'm going to do b equals 2 pi divided by the period. My period is 2 pi divided by 3. You could rewrite this by doing 2 pi divided by my period, 2 pi over 3. And we know when we're dividing a fraction, we need to do keep, change, flip. So 2 pi is really 2 pi over 1. I'm going to keep the first fraction, change this symbol to multiplication, flip my second fraction, and I get 3 over 2 pi. Now we can multiply, but I have 2 pi on the top and bottom, so all I really have left over is 3 over 1, which is 3. We're going to do a couple examples with cosine. So first thing I'm going to find is the midline of my graph. I have a low point at 0. The maximum high point is at 4. So my midline is going to be right in between at 2. Y equals 2. That tells me I'm going to be adding 2 on the very end. I'm going to look for my amplitude going from the midline to the maximum. I see that it took 2 units. So 2 is going to go out in front of cosine. Cosine usually looks like this U shape. So I'm going to trace starting at the y-intercept, 1 full period to get that U shape. And it's still upright. So my 2 is going to stay positive. It will not be negative. And I can see that my period for this graph, it went from 0 to 8 pi. So 8 pi is my period. I'm going to figure out how that is affected in my equation as what I need to fill in for b. So b's formula is 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi over 8 pi. We need to simplify. Pi on top and bottom cancels out. We have 2/8. The top and bottom is divisible by 2. So I get 1/4. And then for my last example, I'm going to start by finding the midline of my graph. I can see that the maximum is at -2, the minimum is at -4. So right in between, I have a midline of -3. -3 goes on the very end of my equation. I need to find the amplitude going from the midline to the maximum. It was just 1 unit. So 1 stays in front of the cosine. Again, we're dealing with cosine, so you're looking for how long it takes you to do that U shape, starting at the y-intercept. My y-intercept, and I have the U shape. It's an upright U, so my 1 stays positive. Going to identify how long that period was. It went from 0 to 2 pi over 5. So 2 pi over 5 is our period, but we want to see how that affects our equation. So we're going to solve for b. b equals 2 pi divided by 2 pi over 5. 2 pi is really 2 pi over 1. We want to keep, change, flip. So keep the first fraction, change the division to a multiplication sign, flip the second fraction, I have 2 pi on the top and bottom. 5 over 1 is really 5. So I put 5 in for my b in the equation.